There's a difference between change and transition, right? I didn't call this podcast Changes in Life. I called it Life in Transition. The good life begins when you stop wanting a better one. Billy Molapis. I don't know how to say the name, but I've really reflected on that a lot. Like, if I want to have the good life, then I need to appreciate the good life that I have and not always see it as not quite good enough, which keeps me from experiencing the good life.
Right.
There's a difference between change and transition, right? I didn't call this podcast Changes in Life. I called it Life in Transition. And the difference is a change, Simit, in your case, could be moving back to where you're from, right? That's a change. But if you don't do the interior work, it's not a transition. Transitions are inside. Right? Paradigm shifts, the way you see yourself, the way you interact with life. If you don't do the transitions, eventually when you make the change, you're going to come back to the same point anyway. I'm Art Blanchford, and this is Life in Transition. Welcome to the 50th episode of Life in Transition podcast, or as I say, Life in Transition at 50, which is really a play on words. It's the 50th episode, and a lot of us are close to that age of 50 of midlife transition. But very, very excited to have a panel with me today for the first time. So we have Bobby Kramer, who's a listener to the podcast, and Gavin Fluke, who is a guest on the podcast, and Jim, who is also my first guest, Jim Hunt, and Mark Barrage, who is a guest on the podcast, and Justin, who is a listener. And a little bit later, we'll have someone joining from Midlife Transition Mastery as well. But all of you, thank you so much for being part of this podcast, first of all, and your engagement with it. And thank you for being here today. Most welcome to the 50th episode of Life in Transition podcast.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start with the listeners, the two that are, or three that are representing listeners to hear. And maybe I'll start with you, Jim. Or sorry, because Jim's a listener and a guest, so both. But maybe I'll start with the listener. So we'll jump into Justin. And I'll tell you very briefly about Justin, that I know Justin here locally in Tennessee, and Justin's been really engaged with me since the beginning of this podcast, and we've really played off and supported each other a lot. But Justin, maybe just give a quick introduction for yourself and a little bit about what Life in Transition podcast has meant to you.
Well, I think one thing that I've learned is my identity isn't what I do. And so I'll start by saying I'm a lifelong learner, and I love to learn and grow. And part of that in the past few years has been personally. It's been a lot of therapy work and different things, and midlife transition came into my life as I started my therapy journey. Art, I reached out to you early in that journey personally, and we went through some different things. And so it's really went step in step with owning a small business, being an engineer, being logical, being all those things, but also dealing with childhood issues, family, narcissism, all the wonderful things that come with it. But hearing your guests talk about it and relate through it and go through their own business struggles and their own life struggles and how they were able to turn around, see the good, see it from a different viewpoint has really helped me wrap my head around my own issues and struggles as I approach that. Being a little bit on the younger end of midlife, in the early 40s here, but it's still been helpful as business has transitioned, as life has transitioned, as my kids have gotten older. It's been really all facets that it's really helped me grow and offer perspective, just like reading a self-help book, but in real life terms from someone that I know and admire. So it's been great.
Thank you very much, Justin. Yeah, it continues to be fun to be on the journey together. I really appreciate that. That's awesome. Thank you. And then jumping over to Bobby, what has listening to this podcast, or what's been your relationship to this podcast? What have you learned? What have you enjoyed about it?
Yeah, I think it's been wonderful to have people on that are so intimate and authentic and really share their experience. Of the ones that I've listened to, I've always gotten something out of it, whether it's led me to further exploring an avenue or a book, or furthering things that resonated from the podcast and furthering that experience in my life from that, which is really neat. And I'm grateful for the guests that come on and share. Certainly certain ones have touched me more than others. And
Yeah. Thank you, Bobby. I value our relationship and what you've shared with me on the podcast all the time, what it's meant to you, and being a very regular listener with a lot of input. I really appreciate that. So thank you. I want to switch over to guests that have been on the podcast, and we'll talk about this. We'll open it up a little bit more, but I want to start with you, Gavin, and not to steal your thunder, but I was really struck by an email I received from you after. I should ask ahead of time, is it okay to share the content of that email that you sent me right afterward?
Yeah.
Because that really hit me. It was one of the high points of me being a host of this podcast. And there's been many. I love the work. I love the authentic conversations. But Gavin sent me an email right afterward and said, wow, I just listened to our episode and I heard my powerful voice maybe for the first time. And my father listened to it and said the same thing. And it just really struck me because that's the only voice I ever heard from Gavin, because I got to know him as doing this podcast. But I thought that was really, I don't know, that seemed like really a gift. So maybe talk a little bit about your experience and what you do and what it's been like for you being a guest on this podcast.
I was introduced to you by a former, I would say, colleague, but actually we weren't particularly close. But we had a shared experience, which was retiring from professional services. And we both had the will to give back to communities, families, and to the profession that had served us over 30 years. And what I learned in that discussion, which is part of what you're alluding to from the email you shared there, is I gave a lot of space at the beginning of that transition period and allowed various things to enter it. And one of those was philanthropy. So I've got involved in quite a few charitable activities. Another one is the continued learning. So despite having 30 years of experience, I realized there's a lot for me to learn. And I followed my curiosity of what that would be without any rigorous, strict schedule or particular pressure timeline. So it really became a voyage of discovery over those 4 years before actually we spoke. But our conversation helped me put a language to it and probably improved my ability to share that story with others.
No, that's great. I really appreciate too that you recognize that it takes some time, right? That these transitions don't happen overnight. You know, you just mentioned 4 years and also the theme of continued learning. And I think that's probably something that all of everybody listening to this podcast, I'm sure that's part of what they're doing is they're continually learning. So no, it was really beautiful. And it was really great to make such a strong connection with you through Gunther, our joint colleague, and the work that he had done to help me along my path, which is what introduced him to the podcast and then to you. So thank you very much, Gavin. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. I know you're doing some very inspiring work, and especially with your support from refugees. Yeah, it's great to see that you're living the life that you want to live in the second half. And that's really inspiring to me, and I think to all of our listeners. So thank you very much. Then we're going to jump to my first guest on the podcast. After I did 7 episodes on my own, my first guest is Jim Hunt. And Jim and I grew up in the same household. We're cousins, but really brothers. And it was amazing to me that someone that I had known closely my whole life, at the time, 52 years, I still learned about Jim on the podcast. And that's what I love so much about these authentic conversations, that even people that I'm super close to, I really get to see something more or learn something more about them by having a guest on the podcast, which is my number one criteria actually for having guests on the podcast, is people that I'm inspired by or think I can learn from. It's going to be a very interesting conversation for me and that I can learn from. And then of course that the rest of the listeners can learn from as well. So with that long introduction, Jim, I'll hand it over to you and you can talk a little bit about what it's been like for you being a guest on this podcast and maybe seeing the whole thing from the beginning, as you were, very involved with it with me and my discussions from the beginning of this podcast. And to think we're at 50 episodes now.
Yeah, 50 episodes. That's a lot. You and I have shared a lot during this time of our lives of change and transition, been very mutually supportive. I know at one point you weren't sure if you were going to have a podcast, for example. So when I came on as your first guest, you hadn't really established a format for that. We just had a conversation, and it was a little bit, it could have been cleaner. It could have been a little more scripted, but something is very authentic about it not being scripted. It was interesting. And it was actually an opportunity for me too, because I hadn't shared my story, my life story, as it were. Obviously I didn't share everything, but I hadn't really tried to take that perspective before, even though I'm analytical and a thinker and constantly looking and considering at the world around me. So that was helpful and interesting to me too. And when I listened to our podcast myself, it was very emotional for me. I was like, wow, that's a lot. And I was curious if anyone else might share some element of that from hearing my story. So the podcast, I do want to speak as a listener too, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
the
please.
Podcast,
absolutely.
Especially since then, I've really loved hearing your guests. In particular, I found your first few podcasts interesting. And once you started interviewing guests, that took on a lot more dimensions. I keep a list of people that I really would love to meet someday. Several of your guests are on that list now.
Oh, great. I can make that introduction if you want.
I've reached out to at least one of them actually on my own just to be supportive and reflect a little. It's been wonderful. It's great food for thought. It's great validation. It's great to see other people growing their awareness and their, I would say, self-confidence, except it's more than that. It's self-knowledge, self-awareness, self-knowledge. Rather than confidence, it's more of a certainty, I guess is why the word self-confidence doesn't feel, self-confidence feels to me like a continuum. Whereas I think I've seen a lot of people on your podcast express a measure of this feels right. This is right. This
So
is
getting this grounded feeling or being comfortable in their own skin.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. I'm very much tuned into and aware of when people are quote unquote marketing for a company, for a cause, for themselves, their image, whatever. And it always feels a bit icky.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been wonderful to listen to people where I don't really pick up that impression. They're just being true to themselves and expressing that. And that's been really wonderful.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jim. I really appreciate you sharing that. That's what I want, is to have authentic conversations. I was reflecting, and I'll go ahead and say this too, because it's authentic. I was reflecting on the podcast that's going to release on Thursday. I just listened to it for the final edit. It was awesome, authentic, real conversation. And I was really 100% present in it. The one that 2 weeks ago, I was nervous on. And when I listened to that one, I could tell that I was trying too hard. I could tell that I was striving and I wasn't as present. The information is still really good. And I've asked some of other listeners, hey, have you noticed a difference? And nobody has yet. But I bet if you guys look, you guys that listen to it a lot, you probably tell the difference from ones that know me really well. And I even had the thought when I was listening to the edit of that one, I could tell the production crew to slow it down. Because the main thing is I was speaking too fast. That's one of the things I do when I'm trying to impress or trying too hard. And then I thought, no, it's okay. Part of what this is being authentic. And that's okay to have it out there just as it is without any doctoring. I left it be. That's my desire, is to really have this space of authentic conversation. And that is what brings people in, listeners in. It's what brings guests in. It brings what brings listeners in. It what brings me in, and that I can learn from and really be present with and hold space and bear witness for the guests on the podcast so that it can be useful for them, for me, and for our listeners. Can I brag on you for a second as well, Jim?
You can.
So, Jim is super inspiration to me from really rebooting his life in the last few years, and accelerated to a great crescendo this year. And I was just at his beautiful house that you see in the background. I was just there for the first visit. But Jim is this year gotten married, starting a new career, and going through school to get his master's to start a new career from computer science to therapist or social worker. Got married, sold 3 properties, 2 houses and a property, and bought a new house and put it together with his wife and his stepchildren there. It's just beautiful. It's in a beautiful place. And I was there 2 weeks ago, and just so amazing to me to see the transformation that you've made in your life in the last 5 years. Really incredible.
Yeah, very different.
And you're getting what the good you deserve, I will say.
Thank
good
you.
For you, Jim.
Yes.
Really appreciate you. And thanks for being here and share your experience, both sides as a listener and a guest, and guest number 1. And now they have the farthest away guest ever so far on the podcast. And probably it's not possible to get one farther away. But Mark Barrett, who I really appreciate, and really appreciate your message and what you shared with people about the persistence to grow and be a little bit stronger, a little bit better each day. So I felt like I made a very strong connection with you just from, the brief introduction that we had, and then doing the podcast together, having this authentic conversation. What was that experience like for you? And pick it up and tell a little bit about yourself and what it's been like with this connection with life in transition.
No, thanks, Art. It was a great privilege to be on the show. And just as we've heard before, having that really connected discussion. And I think I was listening to the other talkers this morning that we have, some of us that might have had familiarity with operating plants, etc. We sort of talk about control limits. We want to have the operate on these control limits all in life. We're all in those control limits to some degree. And it's only when we get those really deeper connections are we a little bit more prepared to share our fears and our doubts and the full extent of our joys and our pride in each other. And actually, I think the more we can find those opportunities, whether it be our cousins/brothers, and I've got one of those as well, or just those really good mates that we spend time with, but we don't ever quite, or we very seldom trip over into those slightly deeper conversations to really just uncover a little bit more about ourselves. Because when we're prepared to share a bit deeper about ourselves, I think we also learn about ourselves a little bit better too. And I guess the whole point of Art's Life in Transition is, as we go through that transition, learning about ourselves in order to be able to do it better. Now, I should say that having been the furthest guest away, I was obviously worried that I might lose that mantle. So I've chosen to go further away for this particular podcast. I haven't gone to Western Australia, which is actually my home part of the country, which would be further away. But I am currently in Tasmania, which is a tiny island. Well, not tiny, it's a decent sized island off the bottom of Australia. And this is where my parents moved to the last 20 years of my mum's life and the last 14 of my dad's life, and built an amazing life here. But unfortunately, my mum passed away a few months ago. So another transition moment of working through what we're going to do with this property in terms of where we want to hold it in the family. But yeah, all those things that I guess trigger all sorts of thoughts in us about have we become the person our parents hope we might be. I guess that's got some importance, but more importantly, have we become the person that the 5-year-old of us thought we might be? And how's that evolved over time? And there's still time, right? There's always time. The only matter that really the moment that matters is now, is today, and what we can move. And I guess, as Art alluded, I had a very nasty bicycle crash in March 2019. I crushed 2 vertebrae, and I felt very broken and shattered for quite a while. A very tough process, hearing that you may not walk again, then battling as hard as I could to regain as much mobility as I could. And really, in that journey, the thing that mattered the most was what I did. Right now, if all I can do is breathe and not go backwards, that's what matters right now. If all I can do is try and strain to move my toes, even if I don't know whether I'm actually moving them, and just trying to remain connected to that part of my body, then that's what I do now. And sometimes we've got to embrace that in our life, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. That's so true. Our whole life happens in the now, and whether we waste the now ruminating on the past or worrying about the future or even hoping for the future, it's still not in the now. But we can use the now to do that, or we can use it to be present. Picking up on the theme that came through here a lot is, what is it that we really want to do? What did our parents want us to do? What did our colleagues want us to do? What did we learn from culture? What did our 5-year-old us want to do? But coming back to the now, what is it that we want to do? And when life gives us transitions, when we have changes, when we have a bicycle crash or lose a spouse or lose a parent, do we take the time to slow down and to get to know ourselves? Jim, you talked about this. There's something in this podcast that helped you to get to know yourself, to be grounded and centered in your own skin. And do we take the time to do that so that we can really say yes to what it is that we really want to do, that really juices us? And I think that sounds really easy. And I know from my experience and from the 45, actually it's been more than that because I already have a bunch of episodes recorded after this one as well. So let's say 50 guests that I've had on. It's also true for them. One of the most difficult things is actually figuring it out, what it is that we want to do with now in this moment, to get clear with ourselves, not all the voices or all the parts of us from the past or what everybody else wanted us to be or do, but to get really clear for ourselves, to decide, to choose, where do we want to spend our energy, right? Where do we want to go forward? How do we want to use the rest of our life? And I think it's a beautiful time on the planet as a whole that we even get to have the luxury of that question. If you think about 100 years ago, you didn't really get to have that question. Life expectancy was 47. So now it's 77, let's call it. So we've gained 30 years in the last 100 years, and that 30 years and the health that comes with that, it gives us the opportunity to ask questions that we never had before. And what a beautiful way to do that if we actually spend the time to get that answer and to lean into it. And Mark, as you said, that there's always now, and it doesn't matter how late or how early it is in life, to get to know ourselves better, to handle and respond to the moment that is now, and then to be really clear, what are the things that really, really juice us? I just got off a coaching call right before this with my coach, and we're talking about revenue plans for next year. And I was starting with the one that I had the most traction on, the revenue line. And she said, no. What are you most excited about?
Yeah.
This episode of the Life in Transition podcast is brought to you by Midlife Transition Mastery. If you have reached midlife and you are successful, you have checked all the boxes, you've done everything you thought you should do, and especially pleasing everybody else, doing what you think everyone else needs you to do, but you still feel like something's missing, like you're coming up empty, feeling alone, feeling misguided or lost. Midlife Transition Mastery Explorer community is for you. Here we will build authentic community. We will learn about the 8 steps to mastering midlife transition. and we will learn and execute living life with no regrets in our second half. Please check out the community on lifeintransition.online/MLTM, Midlife Transition Mastery. And I look forward to seeing you around the fire in this community. And I was like, yeah, but if I'm excited about it, but if I don't have a plan of how I'm going to make revenue, and that doesn't matter. She goes, no, forget that for now. What really juices you? And for me, it was almost tied for the top, but public speaking or speaking to a group live, and then the podcast. Those are the two things that are the most exciting and interesting to me. And then it goes down from there. And so she said, okay, that's what we're going to work on, for no other reason, but because the most important reason, which is that's what you feel really drawn to. And that's what excites you and scares you in a good way. Then that's what you should be doing. And to me, that's what I feel like the luxury of the life that we get to have now, where we have health and we have enough to live and our kids are safe and we're safe. And then we can ask ourselves, how can I contribute? What juices me? What's this, as George Bernard Shaw says, the purpose recognized by myself as a mighty one that I can lean myself into and really do something that I feel is worthwhile and fun and connecting and so forth. Yeah. Let's say other reflections that you have, Justin or anybody else, on this topic of life and transition from what you've learned, or any other reflections on the podcast? Justin.
I just wanted to say, I think the podcast for me has helped a lot in the area of what I want. And I don't mean as in telling me what I want, but helping me recognize it, helping me understand it, and also dealing with the toxic shame of feeling selfish or the things for wanting something. Being able to be in the moment, to be authentic, to feel what you're feeling, the audacity, if you will, to recognize it and move forward with it. I think the podcast helped with it. I think the group work we've done helped with it. And as a kid who grew up without a lot of money, I learned that I had actually pushed my wants out of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started my therapy journey, besides the shame of a man going to therapy, he asked me one day, he said, what do you want? And I was like, you're going to have to tell me what you mean, because I didn't have any personally at that point in my life. And that was the time it started asking the question of, what does that really mean? And what do I want? What do I want for my business? What do I want for life? What do I want for my kids? And your guests answered those questions in different ways. You answered them in different ways in your first 7 podcasts. The group members answered it in different ways. And all of those helped me learn what my way is, what my quiet time is, what is my juice, what is my energy, what makes me happy. It's still a struggle some days, but that's life. That's just one of the things I took from your guest, was their process on what they want, what their focus is, or where they're heading, or why they transitioned, or why they were like, this isn't right, this is right. All of those stories helped me understand myself better by looking inward too and saying, well, what's mine? And so I just wanted to share that about the wants and the shame and things around a lot of this kind of work for men and women sometimes too, especially higher power women. They have that same struggle. So for me, it's just been a blessing from collectively of this process with you and the podcast, even guest yourself, all of it, is there's always little pieces that fill in.
Oh, that's awesome. And that's exactly the intention. It's not, nobody's going to tell you what you should be, but with sharing our stories authentically, authenticity gives a space for our heart to open a little bit, to crack a little bit, and then to see what could that be for me. And look, I see this way of, this person found it this way. This lady found it this way. This lady went through a horrible loss. And then this is how she alchemized that into something different, right?
Exactly.
That's beautiful and well said, Justin. And just for the listeners, when he's talking about the group, that's the Midlife Transition Mastery. That other reflections from either listening and or being on the podcast of Life in Transition as we hit 50 here.
Sure. I wanted to throw in a perspective when I listen to you talking about what excites you as tuning into that. And I hear Justin talking about not recognizing or being aware of his own wants. I suspect there's a lot of that in the people who are the most helped by this work, is that there's a lot of people that have lost touch with what they really want. Certainly I had. But can
you share that story? I know it's in the episode, but that story that you told me about that from a point in your life when you were living in California, you know what I'm talking about.
Sure thing. I will. But let me finish my thought
Sure.
before I get lost in a story. So when I hear you talking about getting excited about something, I even now would struggle, I think, to tune into a feeling as strong as excitement about going in a direction. Like at every moment in my life, I'm at a crossroads, and it's not just two roads. I could go off in an infinite number of directions, up, down, left, right, forward, backward. But what did work for my process was to tune into what felt okay, that ball of tension that I'd been holding in my stomach my whole life, and that I had learned to finally relax. And when I would ask myself, do I want to go this direction, or go this way, or pursue this, or do this? And it could be, do I want to go to the grocery store today?
Yeah.
Right. But it doesn't have to be something that I feel like over the moon to be doing. It's perfectly validating and beautiful to do something that feels okay. Because I don't know what that direction going this way at this crossroads of every moment of my life, I don't know where it's going to lead necessarily. But if it feels okay, if I feel relaxed about it, and and there's at least some level of reward, or I feel like that's probably good, that'd be good, without expecting a specific outcome, but just knowing this heading off in this direction right now is good for me, good for my heart.
Yeah. And that's a great combination of, being in the present moment and then getting to know yourself and to be able to trust, right? I was with a friend on Friday, and he was talking about, like, he's gotten to a place in his life where I'm reading the story on this page and something happens that I might not like, but I know I don't know what's on the next page yet. So I don't judge it anymore. Right. And it takes me back to something I've been living into this last couple of weeks from Eckhart Tolle, right? To accept this moment, this present moment, no matter what it is, as if I had chosen it, even if I hadn't. And it changes my perspective completely. And that's learning to trust myself. I practiced that. The first time I sort of started noticing that, when I was still in my crazy workaholic days, and I'd be in some city somewhere in the world on some day, which is always the case, somewhere usually overseas. And I'd be going for a run in the morning, and I would just come to an intersection and just sense which way to go. Just practice that without any reason. Just, okay, I'm going to turn right. I'm going to go straight. I'm going to turn left. I'm going to go up in the park, whatever it was. That was maybe my first practice of what do I want? Just in those little tiny things of which way to turn when I'm out for a run. So do you still want to share that little bit of a story, Jim?
I don't mind. I'll summarize it quickly. Before I changed my life, in my old life, I realized at some point that I was extremely unhappy, very, very unhappy. And I didn't feel like I was depressed. I just felt very unhappy. There was no spark, no happiness, no joy. And so I thought, well, let me write down a list of things that I would like to do that would be fun. And I sat there with a blank piece of paper and a pen for about 10 or 15 minutes at least, and that paper stayed blank. So that's where I came from to where I am now, which is a very good place. I do connect with joy and laughter, and I feel happiness.
Yeah, that blew my mind. And then I did the process, and it wasn't too different. I mean, it took me a minute to get the tap open. When you told me that really blew my mind. And I'm glad that you took off on a path to figure that out and were willing to, I'll say, risk everything in order to figure that out. Because
I had to.
In the end, life isn't worth living, and we can go there really quickly if we don't figure something out that we really enjoy. It makes us feel good. That makes us feel worthwhile. This episode of the Life in Transition podcast is brought to you by Transition Mastery Coaching. If you have made it to midlife and you're successful and you are going through transitions in your life, in your business, in your career, or in your organization, and you are looking to master those transitions, to make the most of them, to accelerate into the next phase of your organization or your life. If you're facing challenges in your business, challenges in your relationship, challenges in your health, and you really want to transition those quickly, I'm here to guide you for that. And I look forward to working with you. And you can sign up for either Pinnacle Transition Coaching or Summit. Please go to lifeintransition.online/MLTM and scroll to see the Summit and Pinnacle coaching, or reach out to me directly on my email, art@artblanchford.com. And I look forward to connecting with you and helping you to accelerate your transitions to achieve what it is that you want to achieve in the second half in your organization and in your life, so you can live your whole life with no regrets. Any other reflections, Mark or Bobby or Gavin, on the podcast before we switch over and welcome Simit in a minute, who's joined us?
Well, Art, I'd like to pick up on the Eckhart Tolle you talked about. I was actually listening to an Alan Langer book the other day, and the reflection was agonize less about making the decision right, but once you've made the decision, make it right. So rather than making that perfect decision, just as you said, accept the moment. And that's so powerful, the way to pick it up as being, it's a choice. I've chosen this moment. That helps you look forward into how do I make the most of it now? And ultimately, when we talk about that concept of living now, it is always just how do we make the most of whatever we've got in front of us, however we've got here.
Yeah. No, beautiful. Don't worry about making the right decision. Make the decision right. And there's no choice is really what it comes down to. It's not like whether green socks or pink socks are good or bad. It's just which ones do you like, right? And then make that work for you. Any other reflections or comments, Gavin or Bobby, on the podcast?
Yeah, to pick up a point that was discussed earlier, the thing about being, thinking about our conversation and conversations before and after, I did expand my network quite a bit in making my transition. That's one of the things that I set myself to do. Partly COVID forced me to do that because I wasn't in an office environment, but then my retirement put me in a place where I had time on my hands and I was able to make new connections. And that really got me to being, and more of the people that I was meeting, including you, the context was who I was in that moment, in that space, not really so much about what I was doing, because at that time I wasn't really doing anything. And it wasn't really about what I had done. For 30 years, I'd raced and chased to do more and multitask and all that stuff. So it's far more about being, and then that gets into the reflection in the learning. And that's since we spoke in April or May, that being has really become something of a mantra as I speak with my coaching clients, whether I'm on the university faculty that I'm trying to encourage people who are still in that business environment to get away from having a to-do list to thinking about a to-be list. Change the way in which they think of themselves and hopefully accelerating their development at a point where I was still on the to-do list very heavily. But maybe my reflection can help them accelerate and move through a point that I maybe missed.
Yeah, no, but what a beautiful thing, Gavin, that if you can, we don't all have to leave our corporate careers in order to become focused on being. Like, how good would it be for all of global business and the planet if half of the people in the corporate responsibility roles would focus on being first and doing second? All right, that's beautiful. So that's great that you're working on helping make that happen as well in your current role. That's awesome. Bobby, anything else to add? Any other reflections?
Just what comes to mind, you mentioned about focusing and enjoying the moment. On one of your recent podcasts, how do I make the moment sacred? One of your guests shared that, and that stood out to me as well. We spoke not too long ago, and you had mentioned the moment. And then when I'm hearing how to make the moment sacred from one of your recent guests, it seemed to enhance that whole idea.
Yeah. And that attention and being present to it is how it makes it sacred, right? And that's the narrow gate is the present moment to a sacred life and to a joy-filled life. And one you remind me of a lot when we talk, Bobby. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. And then I also want to welcome Simit. So welcome into the 50th episode, Simit. Thank you for being here.
Sorry for being late. Really
no worries. No worries. It works out well that Simit was one of the guys that's joined our Midlife Transition Mastery, and we've had a lot of great discussions and been part of that group and really close connection with a couple of the other guys on here. But Simit, you and I talked, and I said it's not about this podcast also, and Midlife Transition Mastery even, it's not about having all the answers, but it's about engaging in the process and being in the present and going forward with that. And I'm just a little bit curious in your experience so far, what's it been like to be engaged with Midlife Transition Mastery and with this crazy crew of us going through midlife together here?
I try to reflect on the moment this started and now, and it's like, wow, it's a lot of ways to go, but amazing where I've come to from that moment. And by the way, congratulations, Jim, on your wedding. I heard the great news there. Justin, Jim, it's a great friendships, even though we haven't all physically met yet, to come this far, able to share it with folks, the judgment-free zone. I'll throw some things out there because I'm still living the old life of to-dos maybe, and the way my mind works. I'm going to try to bullet point it out. Being more present, taking things slower. Everything's not shameful, because that word is very different than guilt.
What's the difference to you, Simit, on that?
So 7 years ago, I learned what the difference between shame and guilt is. And I can probably say now, I'm probably putting it into action, the difference is.
And what's the difference?
Shame is permanence. Shame is permanence. Guilt is not. We all have our journey and our struggles. And the things that I've been struggling with or shameful about, maybe to an academic exercise or someone else would be like, that's really nothing. but it's been something for me, and it's okay. This group has taught me that things are not permanent. Things can be changed. It is the way of thinking about things, being comfortable about talking about those uncomfortable things. Because when you speak aloud to it and put structure to it and have other people around to, sometimes you start laughing at yourself because you're like, you made this big bad monster in your head up that really wasn't that big and bad. And some of the things that, you sort of read before in a textbook about or a podcast, but now living it, saying, yeah, you make mountains out of moles and things of that nature. So I'm more cognizant of that. Little things like just this week, my wife saying, life's just going to flash you by because you're trying to like curate it to this and that and this. And with the 10 and 7-year-old, the 10-year-old being like a teenager almost, it's just starting to hit me more. And she's right. And I'll end with this. Some of the folks in here have seen sort of my almost unhealthy itch to go back to where I'm from, that I've been dovetailing that comment to what my wife said. I've been still losing the moments, losing the enjoyment of life because I'm thinking like going back to where I'm from is going to solve these problems or show me something else. And it goes back to what Art we've talked about, is putting in the work on yourself. And I truly am more now, all fingers point at myself. All fingers always point at me. I am the only one and will always be the only one to decide and control a lot of these things. It's become a lot more clear. So it's
That's
awesome.
beautiful. Thank you, Simit, for sharing that. And I wanted to highlight one of the things that you said about midlife transition. We had a group meeting last week, and a couple of guys in that meeting, we have a group it's called Ideal Group. It's 12 groups where we really all have authentic conversations together and support each other on this growth. And a couple of guys in that group, without anybody else telling them anything, made decisions about their next steps, things they've been thinking about for a long time, simply by us having a safe container for authentic conversation and then being able to see and hear that coming out loud. And that to me is really beautiful, and the purpose of the group. A couple other things I want to expand on that you mentioned about being present in life. I have this quote that I found recently. It's on one of the meditation apps that I have, but I took a screenshot, and it says, "The good life begins when you stop wanting a better one." Billy Molapis. I don't know how to say the name, but I've really reflected on that a lot. Like, if I want to have the good life, then I need to appreciate the good life that I have and not always see it as not quite good enough, which keeps me from experiencing the good life.
Right.
There's a difference between change and transition, right? I didn't call this podcast Changes in Life. I called it Life and Transition. And the difference is a change, Simit, in your case, could be moving back to where you're from, right? That's a change. But if you don't do the interior work, it's not a transition. Transitions are inside.
Oh,
Right? Paradigm shifts, the way you see yourself, the way you interact with life. If you don't do the transitions, eventually when you make the change, you're going to come back to the same point anyway.
Yeah.
You don't do the work to make the transition.
It made me realize, a lot of the aha moments. I can see why my parents have been so happy because of the interior work. We never had the material things. I get it now. I get it.
Oh, it's beautiful. Beautiful. Other comments or reflections? Yeah, Justin.
Well, I just wanted to comment too on the group aspect where Simit really mentioned it's a really trusting, judge-free zone. My first foray into that was when I started my therapy journey. My therapist was like, "You have some childhood trauma." He used that word. And I was having a conversation with a really good friend who's an ex-military guy, saw a lot of combat, saw a lot of things. And I was like, my trauma is not like your trauma. And he did look me dead in the eyes and was like, "Trauma's trauma. It rewires the brain. Don't compare."
Yeah.
And this group, the podcast, has all echoed that in the sense of we can all relate. We all are human. We've all had experiences. And I haven't felt a judgment bone toward me at all from anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And just want to kind of re-echo that as when you're looking for groups, when you're looking for therapists, when you're looking for those people to connect with and mentors and friends and everything else, that's how it should be.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to echo that.
No, thank you. That's the whole point, right? Is to have this, I call authentic conversations where we, make it safe enough to be real and really challenge each other and love each other and not have judgment and feel like we can put, have the real conversations. I just finished a training with Modern Elder Academy, Chip Conley's place, and they talk about these. There's a lot of research. This is called level 3 conversations. There's level 1, which is the daily transactions of life, and level 2, the things that you could sort of talk about with your normal friends and family, football and the weather and how are the kids and how's the job and what do you do, right? These things. And then level 3, which is what do you love? What are you passionate about? What scares you? What are you obsessing about right now? And to really open up your heart a little bit. And the more we can have level 3 conversations, I think the healthier we are. And that's really the underlying thing of everything that I'm doing here is to try to create space for this level 3 conversations.
I would say in life, it's level 3 conversations. Life wouldn't be great if we're always having them, I think.
That's right.
It's not for me. However, to always feel that I could at any time that I needed to or wanted to is really important.
Yeah, that's very well said. Very well said, Jim. Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.
And I'd also say, level 3 reflection. So actually, as we're really thinking about what we want to stand for and want to achieve in the balance of our life, actually having those quieter moments to reflect and to really think about those things, and then to stay true to those resolutions we make. Because I know for me, and I think for many, that being hectic is addictive, and then you're back on the hamster wheel in some other way, shape or form, and actually just allowing ourselves to have that space to think and to make sure we're actually on track and being true to what we feel we need is very valuable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Mark. I absolutely appreciate that. So I have one little fun trivia question. The most important thing about this podcast to me is the connections that it makes, the authentic conversations that it gives space for, and then it gives rise for that in our listeners as well. And I was looking before we recorded this just to see what the reach is in, and I'm curious, and this would surprise me a little bit, so I'll give you that hint that this surprised me. How many countries do you think have listened to Life in Transition podcast? How many countries has it been listened to from? Any thoughts?
20.
20?
15.
15?
I'm going to go 38.
38?
74. I doubled it.
42.
42.
The meaning of life.
So at 25, I don't remember, but it was around 28 when we did the 25th episode, because that was the last time I looked it up. So I looked it up today, on the day we're recording this, which is November 19th. It won't come out for a little while, but today when I looked it up, it was 102 countries.
Wow.
102.
That's pretty cool.
Wow.
For a guy that's lived all over the world and done all that stuff. And many of those are only one listener, right? A whole bunch of them are just 10 or fewer listeners. But still, it's kind of cool that it's in 102 countries. And there's a big representation, if both from lived experience as well as citizenships. Even on this call today, there's a big representation of how it is in the world. So that's been really fun to me. But I open up the floor for any parting shots or reflections or comments that anybody wants to make before we wrap up here.
I just wanted to say that I've really had some paradigm shifts. I've had some really moments from listening to your podcast, Art, and that's really made a difference in my life. I feel guided, and it seems to fit into my life in a lot of ways. That I just wanted to let you know how powerful it has been in my life. And I could go on about individual moments from different guests that have made an impact in my life. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bobby. Thank you for listening and being on here with us today. Thank you very much.
I wanted to say, sorry for being late, but the ability to, it's interesting how a completely disparate group of men from different parts of the world or nation and yet can connect, is that it's okay to be yourself. It's okay to be selfish. It's okay to want things. It's living your life. To say, quite frankly, probably have not been the way I thought I've been. So because he's listening to the men in this group here and really doing good work with the group to say, what do you want out of life? To pause for that. And people always like, I'm too busy. No, it's not. You got to really pause. And it's okay to pause. And for me, at least, to be selfish and not feel shameful. For me, that's a big deal. And I carry that a lot with me. And I feel it's always been there, right? And now just sort of seeing and having some of those aha moments is huge.
That's awesome.
Couldn't do it without that group, to make you think through things, to connect with them, to touch base with them offline, to get their thoughts. People are really giving of their time and their wisdom.
Yeah,
it's really
I
precious.
think that's one of the things that's magical about this group that we do together. It's not about me. It's about everybody in the group and how we support each other. And that's really cool. And I want to challenge one of the things that you said, Simit, because you said it's not about being selfish. It's not. There's nothing like doing what it is that, I'm going to say it this way, that's God's gift for you to do on the planet is not selfish. In fact, it's the opposite. It's given to you to give to everybody else, right? If you think about that, I did the Artist Way this year, and she talks about that there, that God's gift to us is our creativity. And our gift to God, to society and to God, is what we do with it. And that creativity is fueled by what it is that we love to do. So it's our job to figure that out and to do that. And that's the least selfish, the most giving thing we can actually do. So final thoughts, Justin, before we wrap up.
I just want to say thank you for your gift, from your personal conversations with me to your book, to the podcast, to the group work and just everything else, and your desire to continue to learn and grow through your own struggles, your own trials, your own tribulations, and then to have the authenticity to share that openly and offer other people that helping hand that you were fortunate enough to be able to get yourself. There's no greater gift to my side, probably to most of the panel members here, but also the fact that you're amazingly humble in that is impressive. And we'll pat you on the back if you won't. So thank you, Art.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for being here, for taking your time today from crazy time zones all the way 5 o'clock in the morning to Mark, and very late in Central Europe, Eastern Europe to Gavin. But thank you guys all for being here and being engaged in this podcast and being engaged with my life. I really appreciate it. So thank you for reflecting at 50 for the Life in Transition podcast. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Art.
Appreciate you, Art. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.
All right. See you.
I can't wait to hear what action you are taking. Connect with me on LinkedIn or our website, lifeintransition.online, and let me know. Let a friend know too. It could be a huge encouragement to them and keep you on the track. Thank you so much for joining me today. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and it would mean a lot to me if you left a review and shared this episode with a friend. If you want to learn more about me and what I do when I'm not podcasting, please visit me at artblanchford.com. Thank you for listening. Together, let's make the most of life in transition.